Listen closely, because what you are about to hear is not random. If your attention ended up here, it wasn't by coincidence. Out of endless scrolling and countless posts, something made you pause, and that pause carries meaning. Before this reaches the end, you will begin to understand a strange emotional situation involving someone in your life who has been pulling away while still not fully letting you go. Their behavior feels inconsistent, confusing, and emotionally charged in ways that don't quite make sense on the surface. Don't rush past this. Stay with it, because the pattern behind this connection is about to become clearer. There is a specific person tied to your emotional world, and what you have been experiencing as mixed signals is actually a deeper inner struggle they are quietly going through. This person you're thinking about carries feelings that run much deeper than what they ever express outwardly. In moments of silence, thoughts of you return without effort or invitation. They replay conversations, remember your words, and revisit small interactions, trying to understand what they meant on a deeper level. Even when they act distant, there is a pull they cannot fully disconnect from. Something about you lingers in their mind longer than they expect or understand. The conflict inside them is not as simple as attraction or distance. It connects to how they emotionally interpret your presence, including aspects linked to your appearance, but not in the way of comparison or standards. It is something more internal, tied to meaning, emotion, and what they feel when they look at you. Unlike most people who only see what is obvious, this person notices what others overlook. Where the world registers your expressions on the surface, they sense what is happening underneath them. Your smile feels layered to them, not just as happiness but sometimes as concealment. Your laughter can sound like joy mixed with fatigue. Even your quiet moments speak to them in ways you may not realize. They pay attention to shifts in your energy, your eyes, your silence, and the emotional tone behind your presence. This level of awareness makes the connection feel unusually deep to them, almost overwhelming at times. Instead of something casual or easy to define, you become someone they cannot simply read and move past, and that creates both attraction and internal tension. The real challenge for them is not about any physical trait. It is about what your presence reflects back to them emotionally. You carry a natural authenticity that stands out in a world where many people hide behind carefully constructed versions of themselves. Around you, things feel more exposed, more honest, and that honesty forces them to face parts of themselves they usually avoid. This is where the intensity comes from. One moment they feel drawn in, and the next they instinctively step back. It is not confusion without reason, but an internal conflict they have not resolved. Every interaction with you activates emotions they are not fully prepared to process, which creates the push and pull you may have already noticed. Over time, the emotional barriers they built are beginning to weaken. Even if they don't fully realize it yet, the distance they try to maintain is becoming less stable. Something between you is building toward a moment that may seem small externally, but will feel significant underneath it all. It could be a simple exchange, a passing glance, or even a silence that suddenly feels heavier than usual. After that moment, their understanding of their own behavior will begin to shift. What once looked like inconsistency will start to make sense as fear of emotional exposure, fear of being truly seen, and fear of what it means to connect with someone who feels as real as you. They also carry with them small, precise memories of you that remain vivid in their mind. The way your expression changes when you are holding something back, the subtle shift in your eyes when you feel hurt, or the quiet softness that appears when you feel understood. These details stay with them longer than they expect, and surface in moments they cannot control. What started as casual awareness slowly becomes something more consuming, and they find themselves thinking about you without intention. The more they notice, the more they feel their emotional control slipping, as if something within them is being pulled into deeper attachment. At the core of it all is a deeper truth they are not fully aware of yet. What they struggle to accept about you is connected to something buried in their own past. You awaken emotions they had long suppressed, not because you caused anything, but because your presence reflects something they once tried to forget. That is why they sometimes go quiet or appear distant without explanation. It is not a lack of feeling, but the weight of feeling too much at once. In those moments, they are confronting parts of themselves they never expected to face again, and that is where the real emotional conflict quietly begins. That overwhelming way they act around you is not actually rejection. It is emotional fear colliding with feelings they cannot fully control or explain. What looks like distance is really internal pressure building inside them because part of them is deeply drawn in while another part is afraid of what that means. And slowly, that resistance is starting to lose strength. Their emotions are no longer staying neatly contained. Even when they try to step back, something about you remains in their system. Deep down, they are beginning to realize they cannot simply replace what they feel with you. No one else gives them that same sense of being emotionally seen. No one else reaches that depth inside them. And as this internal shift continues, their behavior starts moving toward a point where avoidance no longer feels sustainable. In their everyday life, they may appear composed, steady, and emotionally neutral with others, but that changes completely when it comes to you. Their inner world becomes louder, more reactive, and harder to manage. It often starts with small things that seem insignificant to everyone else but feel powerful to them. The way your expression changes when you are holding something back, the quiet emotions behind your confidence, the subtle sadness that shows through even when you try to hide it. They don't just see your appearance on a surface level, they read emotional meaning into it. What they are experiencing is not ordinary attraction but something closer to deep emotional recognition, where your presence triggers feelings they cannot easily turn off. Even when they try to distract themselves or convince themselves to move on, the pull keeps bringing them back to you. Conversations, routines, and other people may fill the space temporarily, but the emotional connection keeps resurfacing. What first drew them in was a moment they still remember clearly, even if you don't. Something in your presence felt strangely familiar to them, like a mix of softness, quiet strength, and an unspoken emotional depth. That moment created a lasting imprint. Since then, their reactions around you have never been fully the same. Sometimes they pull away because the intensity feels overwhelming, not because it is empty. And at its core, what unsettles them is how deeply they already care, even while trying not to admit it. Not beauty in the usual, surface-level way, but something deeper, emotional beauty. The kind that doesn't need explanation, the kind that settles in someone's thoughts late at night when everything else is quiet. The kind that doesn't leave easily, even when someone tries to forget it. The kind that lingers in silence and slowly reshapes the way a person feels about love, connection, and even themselves. And if you stay with this, you'll start to understand why this connection feels so different, so heavy, and so impossible for that person to fully walk away from. Very soon, the person you're thinking about will begin showing what they've been holding back for a long time. Not in one clear confession at first, but in small, unplanned moments. A message sent without overthinking, a glance that lasts a little too long, a brief moment where their emotions slip through the control they've been trying so hard to maintain. And when that happens, you'll start to see what was always beneath the surface. They were never truly focused on judging you. They were trying to manage what you made them feel. Because deep down, they already sense you are unlike anyone else they have encountered before, and that realization is what unsettles them the most. What they also see more than you realize is how hard you can be on yourself. They notice the quiet insecurities you try to hide, the way you shift away from attention when you feel exposed, the small moments where confidence and self-doubt collide behind a smile. And instead of making their feelings weaker, it does the opposite. It deepens them. Because to them, what you might see as flaws are not flaws at all. They are signs of something real, something human, something they don't forget. In a world where most people carefully construct versions of themselves, your authenticity stands out in a way you don't even notice. Late at night, when distractions fade, their thoughts return to one quiet fear they don't say out loud, the fear of losing you. Not because everything is perfect, but because something about you has already taken root in them. They find themselves questioning what would happen if you were no longer present in their life in even small ways. And that thought keeps pulling them back into reflection, into memory, into emotional awareness they can't fully shut off. It becomes harder for them to pretend they are unaffected, because the emotional impact you have on them is already real, even if unspoken. Over time, their resistance begins to weaken. The distance they try to maintain doesn't feel as stable as it once did. Every interaction adds something new, even when nothing major is said. And the strange part is how automatic their reactions become around you, their attention shifting toward you without effort, their emotions responding before logic catches up. It confuses them because they are used to being in control of how they feel, and with you that control feels incomplete. At the core of it all, what they struggle to accept is not something about your appearance in a shallow sense, but what your presence represents emotionally. Maybe it's the softness in your expression when you're tired, or the quiet honesty in your eyes when you're not trying to impress anyone. Maybe it's the emotional openness you don't even realize you show. Whatever it is, It makes them feel something rare, safety mixed with vulnerability. And that combination is what unsettles them, because when someone feels safe, they stop guarding themselves the same way. That is why they sometimes pull away without warning. Not because the feeling disappears, but because it becomes too real to handle easily. And in those moments when they're alone, they replay everything. The small details, the subtle expressions, the unspoken emotions you never verbalized but still revealed. Those moments stay with them longer than anything else, shaping the way they think about you even when you're not present. And slowly, something unavoidable begins to form inside them. They start comparing others to you without intending to. Conversations feel different. Connections feel incomplete. Even silence with other people doesn't carry the same weight. Because what you brought into their emotional world isn't easily replaced. It wasn't perfection that drew them in. It was something far more grounding, realness. And once someone experiences that kind of emotional truth, it becomes difficult to ignore or forget. At its deepest level, what they struggle with and what draws them in are actually connected. The very things they notice about you are what make them trust you more. Your imperfections make you feel honest to them. Your emotional transparency makes you feel safe. And in a world where so many people hide behind carefully built masks, your natural way of being feels like something rare and unrepeatable. That is why they return to you emotionally, even when they try to step away physically. Because on some level, they already know they are not experiencing something temporary. They are experiencing something that stays. The signs are already becoming noticeable. Their behavior around you is not staying the same, even if they are trying to act normal. There is a shift in how often they think about you, how strongly they react to your presence, and how easily their composure slips when you are involved. The emotional distance they once relied on is no longer as solid as it used to be. Little by little, the walls they built are weakening, and eventually, what once felt confusing will start to make sense. Those moments where they seemed distracted, overly quiet, or unexpectedly intense were never random. They were part of an internal struggle they could not fully express, as something deeper kept pulling them toward you even while they tried to resist it. What is unfolding is not a temporary reaction or a passing interest. It is something that is moving toward emotional clarity. What often gets misunderstood in these narratives is the idea that one person is constantly meant to realize something inevitable about the other. In reality, emotional bonds form through interaction, consistency, shared vulnerability, and timing. Without those, the mind can amplify meaning in ways that feel profound but are still unconfirmed in real life. So the core of this topic isn't about hidden destiny or guaranteed confession. It's about how human attachment works when emotion, uncertainty, and imagination overlap. People don't just react to others, they also react to what those others make them feel about themselves. And that internal reaction is usually where the strongest part of the connection actually comes from. When this kind of emotional dynamic continues without clarity, it often starts to shift shape inside both people. What begins as curiosity or intensity can slowly turn into something heavier, where thoughts become more frequent but communication doesn't necessarily become clearer. That gap between inner experience and outer expression is usually where confusion grows the most. A person might feel deeply affected, but still not know how to translate that feeling into stable action or direct words. In that stage, the mind often starts filling in the blanks. When there is silence, it doesn't feel neutral anymore, it starts to feel meaningful. When someone pulls away, it doesn't just feel like distance, it starts to feel like emotional significance. This is how attachment can intensify even without consistent real-world reinforcement. The emotional system responds to uncertainty by trying to solve it, which is why the other person can become mentally central even when they are not physically present. At the same time, the person experiencing these feelings may not be fully aware of how much space the other is taking up in their thoughts. They might rationalize it, distract themselves, or minimize it outwardly, but internally the emotional weight keeps returning. That return is what creates the cycle of approach and withdrawal. They feel pulled in, then overwhelmed, then they step back, then they feel the absence again, and the loop continues. What complicates things further is that emotional intensity is often mistaken for emotional certainty. Just because someone feels strongly doesn't always mean they understand what they feel or where it should lead. Strong emotion can exist without clarity, commitment, or even readiness. And when that happens, the connection can feel powerful but unstable at the same time. If the situation stays unspoken for too long, it usually reaches one of two directions. Either both people eventually bring honesty into it and define what the connection actually is in real terms, or the emotional charge slowly loses momentum as life, time, and distance reduce its intensity. Most unresolved connections don't end in a dramatic moment. They fade through gradual emotional recalibration when there is no clear structure holding them in place. The important shift that eventually happens in these dynamics is awareness. At some point, one or both people begin to recognize that guessing, interpreting, and reading between the lines is no longer enough. Emotional ambiguity stops feeling exciting and starts feeling draining. That is usually when real communication becomes necessary, if the connection is going to continue in a healthy or meaningful way. So the deeper truth behind all of this is not about hidden certainty between two people. It is about how the mind reacts when it doesn't have clear answers. It creates meaning, attaches significance, and builds narratives to reduce uncertainty. And while those narratives can feel powerful, what actually determines the outcome is what is eventually said, shown, and consistently acted on in reality. When ambiguity continues for a long time, something subtle starts to change in how both people relate to the connection. The emotional intensity doesn't necessarily disappear, but it becomes less stable and more mentally exhausting. Instead of feeling exciting or meaningful, it can start to feel like constant internal noise, thinking, questioning, interpreting, and reinterpreting the same patterns without ever reaching a clear conclusion. At this point, the brain begins trying to regain balance. One common way this happens is emotional distancing, even while feelings are still present. A person might still think about the other, but they start reducing how much importance they assign to those thoughts. They may appear more detached, not because the emotion is gone, but because they are trying to protect their attention and energy from something that feels unresolved. On the other side, if there has been a strong emotional imprint, reminders can still trigger reactions. Certain memories, places, conversations, or even moods can bring the feeling back instantly. That's because emotional memory doesn't work like logical memory. It doesn't fade just because time passes. It fades when it is replaced by new emotional experiences that carry equal or greater weight. This is also where misunderstandings often form. One person may interpret distance as loss of interest, while the other may experience it as self-regulation. One may think the connection is fading, while the other is still processing it internally. Without communication, both perspectives can drift further apart, even if the underlying emotion never fully disappears. Over time, what determines whether a connection grows or dissolves is not intensity, but stability. Intensity can create strong feelings quickly, but stability is what allows those feelings to exist in a real, sustainable way. Without it, the connection remains in a loop of emotional spikes and drops, rather than developing into something grounded. Eventually, every emotionally charged but undefined connection reaches a point where it either becomes clearer or becomes less central in a person's life. Clarity doesn't always mean a relationship forms. It can also mean understanding that the emotional pattern is not something to act on. In both cases, what changes is not just the connection itself, but the meaning the person assigns to it. And that shift is often quiet. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic realization. It happens slowly, as attention moves elsewhere, life demands increase, and the emotional system naturally reorganizes itself around what is most consistent, reciprocal, and real in daily experience. When that slow shift begins, the emotional bond doesn't necessarily vanish. It simply loses its constant priority in the mind. Thoughts that once felt automatic start to appear less frequently, and when they do appear, they carry less urgency. The person is still aware of the connection, but it no longer dominates their internal world the way it once did. This is often mistaken for falling out of feelings, but in many cases, it is actually the mind stepping out of emotional overfocus. What replaces that overfocus is usually a gradual return to self-stability. Attention moves back toward personal routines, responsibilities, and present-moment experiences. The brain naturally reorganizes emotional energy toward what is consistent and responsive in real life. Connections that are unclear, unpredictable, or uncommunicated begin to lose their grip, not because they were meaningless, but because they lacked structure to sustain ongoing emotional investment. In some cases, reflection happens later. When distance has already formed, a person may look back and reinterpret the entire dynamic with more emotional distance. Moments that once felt intense may now feel smaller, more understandable, or less emotionally charged. This doesn't erase what was felt. It just reframes it through a calmer perspective. Emotional memory tends to soften when it is no longer being actively reinforced. At the same time, if any part of the connection was genuinely significant, it can leave a lasting imprint in how a person approaches future relationships. They may become more cautious, more self-aware, or more intentional about emotional boundaries. Even unresolved connections often contribute to personal emotional growth in this way, shaping how someone recognizes intensity versus compatibility in the future. And importantly, what often gets misunderstood is that emotional fading is not always about rejection or replacement. It is frequently about regulation. The mind cannot stay in a heightened emotional state indefinitely, so it naturally seeks equilibrium. When clarity, reciprocity, or consistency is missing, the system adjusts itself by reducing emotional intensity over time. So the final stage of these dynamics is not usually a dramatic ending, but a quiet realignment. The feelings don't always get erased, they get reclassified in importance. What once felt central becomes a memory, what once felt urgent becomes understood, and what once felt overwhelming becomes part of a larger emotional experience that the person eventually learns to carry without being controlled by it. If the pattern continues long enough without clarity or consistent action, the emotional story doesn't just soften, it restructures. The mind stops treating the connection as something unfolding in real time and starts treating it as something stored. It becomes part of memory rather than daily emotional engagement. That shift is important because memory doesn't carry the same urgency as active attachment. At that stage, what changes most is interpretation. The same moments that once felt loaded with meaning, silence, distance, brief interactions, are no longer automatically filled with emotional assumptions. The brain becomes less likely to search for hidden signals and more likely to accept things at face value. This is often where emotional peace starts returning, even if the connection itself still exists in the background of memory. If there was genuine emotional impact, it doesn't disappear completely. Instead, it becomes something the person can think about without being pulled into it. The emotional charge drains out gradually, not because it was fake, but because the nervous system no longer treats it as unresolved. Humans are not designed to stay in long-term emotional uncertainty, so the system eventually prioritizes stability over intensity. This is also where people sometimes misread the situation in hindsight. They may believe they lost something meant to be, when in reality they were experiencing a connection that never fully developed into something structured. Without communication, consistency, or mutual confirmation, the mind fills gaps that reality never actually defined. And once distance grows, those imagined gaps slowly collapse. At the same time, the emotional experience still has value. Even when it doesn't turn into a defined relationship, it often reveals patterns about attachment, attraction, insecurity, and emotional responsiveness. People learn what pulls them in, what confuses them, and what they need in order to feel secure. That awareness becomes more important over time than the initial intensity itself. Eventually, what remains is perspective. The connection is no longer a question that needs solving, but an experience that has already completed its emotional cycle. It can be remembered without confusion, without urgency, and without the need for meaning beyond what actually happened. And that is usually the point where the mind finally lets it exist as part of the past, not as something unfinished. At that point, something very subtle but important happens. The emotional pull that once felt external starts to feel internal instead. In the beginning, it feels like the other person is doing something to you, affecting your mood, your thoughts, your attention. But as clarity develops, the mind begins to recognize that most of the intensity was actually coming from within, from interpretation, anticipation, hope, uncertainty, and emotional projection layered onto real interactions. Once that realization settles, the connection loses a lot of its mystery. Not because it was meaningless, but because the unknown parts stop being filled with imagination. The brain no longer keeps rebuilding scenarios around what the other person might feel or might mean. It starts focusing more on what is actually shown through behavior, consistency, and communication. And when those are limited, the emotional system naturally stops investing as heavily. This is also where emotional maturity often deepens. A person begins to separate feeling from fact. They can acknowledge, "I felt strongly," without immediately concluding, "Therefore it was destined or mutual." That separation is what brings stability. It allows someone to respect their emotional experience without being controlled by it. Over time, the emotional weight that once felt overwhelming turns into understanding. Instead of replaying moments to search for hidden meaning, The mind starts using those memories as reference points for self-awareness. Questions shift from, "What did they feel?" to "Why did I feel that strongly?" That change is powerful because it returns control to the person experiencing the emotions rather than the uncertain dynamic itself. And eventually, what remains is a calmer, more grounded perspective. The connection is no longer something pulling attention in unpredictable ways. It becomes part of a broader life narrative, one chapter among many, rather than an unresolved focus. The intensity fades, but the insight remains, and that insight is what actually stays useful long after the emotional charge is gone.